Welcome to Gardening in the Mountains, Garden Stonework. My name is Allison Arnold. I'm the extension agent here in Buncombe County, and I'll be your host today. We'll make time throughout the program for questions and invite you to put your questions in the chat box. We want to welcome you to Gardening in the Mountains Garden Stonework. Drystone Joe Dinwiddie is a stonemason and an educator. He has a master's degree in vocational agricultural education and has 4 certifications from the Drystone Walling Association of Great Britain. He's been designing, building, and restoring stonework and teaching stonemasonry throughout the U.S. for 28 years. Joe designed and patented a stone arch puzzle, and he's currently revising his manual on stonework. We're really happy to have Drystone Joe Dinwiddie here today to give us inspiration and some tips and tricks for our next garden stonework project. Thank you so much for joining us, Joe.
Thank you, Allison and John, for having me join the Gardening in the Mountains program. I'm glad to be here virtually with you all. I'm speaking to you from Gallup, New Mexico, where I have a stone project underway. I'd like to give an overview of what we'll talk about today. And if questions come up during the presentation, please consider typing that into the chat box. Some of the topics that we're going to look at today are types of stone, sources of stone, tools that are helpful to move stone, tools for shaping stone, different ways that it's possible to move stone, ways to shape stone, and then a special on retaining walls I call 15 Great Rock Hits, the 15 principles that make retaining walls last the longest globally. Safety, a very important part if you're going to be doing stonework in your own garden. Project planning, project design, and then best practices for specific projects such as benches or other types of endeavors in your gardens. So what I'd like to start with is the very first image here, stonemasonry in the landscape. This image is sandstone. All of the sandstone in the picture is from central Tennessee. It's quarried in between Nashville and Knoxville, called Crab Orchard sandstone. There's some dimensional pieces within the bench, then some boulders as the backrest of the bench, and then what's called flagstone, the flat work of that. The singular thing in that image that is not stone is fire brick. If any of you are going to be building a fire feature, it's a really good idea to have some kind of buffer between flame and stone. Flame makes stone crack, and if it's wet enough stone, it can actually explode. I've seen it happen in a bonfire where they were doing a cookout. So that's some examples of sandstone from central Tennessee. I'm going to move on to the overview of the types of stone. The 3 basic types of stone that you'll be able to choose from in your garden projects are sedimentary stone. For example, the sandstone on the previous image is a sedimentary, and then limestone. Usually those stones are formed and break out in really consistent horizontal beds with a flat top and a flat bottom. In Western North Carolina, there's a significant amount of igneous stone, basalt, granite, obsidian, tuff, then metamorphic stone, which also has some examples of that in Western North Carolina, schist, gneiss, quartzite, and marble. It's a really good idea to consider when you're looking at types of stone, what's the best fit for your project. Really flat stone works well for patios, walkways, landings. Irregular stone might often best be used as just a feature stone or water feature or something like that. So matching the type of stone to the project you're doing can really help make projects go more smoothly. If what you have on your property is river rock, you might want to look at buying some flagstone for patios. Making patios out of river rock is challenging to walk on or move furniture across. Here's some examples of those. On the left is the Crab Orchard sandstone from Central Tennessee. That's sedimentary. The wall in the upper right has all of the types of stone. That's primarily salvage stone. It's got granite, sandstone, limestone, multiple examples of that. The picture of me at a quarry, that's in Swannanoa, North Carolina, the Drystone Quarry. That's a 7.5 ton boulder at the Swannanoa Quarry, which we extracted to install at the Outward Bound School. Sources of stone. For those people that are in Western North Carolina, one of the easiest places to get stone is to go to a stone yard. There's usually a lot of choices of types of stone, dimensions of stone, colors of stone. If you are in Western North Carolina, the Hips Stone Yard, where I did quite a bit of business for 12 years, they have 5 or 6 different locations with a wide variety of stone, including all the images I've shown so far. Some quarries will allow you to go to the quarry and hand pick the stone that you want. Most people doing that are stonemasons. However, if you really have a good idea of what you're after and have the equipment to load it, that's an additional option as a source of stone. Last but not least, salvaging or recycling stone. If you have stone on your property of a former feature, that's an option. Sometimes when new construction projects are underway, for example, if an excavator is digging into the ground to start the construction of a house or a building, that stone has to go somewhere. I've done several projects through the years with stone that was quarried like that. A friend of mine in Western North Carolina recycled stone that were the cutoffs and discarded stone from the Blue Ridge Parkway construction, which was 100 years ago. When he was up there, he met a park ranger and said, "Hey, I see all this stone from the old construction. What's the story of it?" And they said, "If you can get it out of there, you do us a favor." With the winch on his truck, he pulled up several stones of the cutoffs and discards. Primarily, you can see those on the bridges that go across the Blue Ridge Parkway. So, recycling stone, salvaging stone, sometimes curbs can be recycled into building projects. So, that's an important, often economical way to gather your stone building materials. It's just important to make sure you have the tools to do that safely. Here's some examples of sources of stone. The stone on the left is a sandstone, and that type, those dimensions, is called a flagstone. It's most often for projects you're going to do that are what I call flat work. It's in the ground, it's a patio, a landing, a walkway. This is sandstone quarried in central Arkansas that I used for a large project out in California. The top right image in this group of pictures is a limestone quarry in my hometown of Louisville, Kentucky. And this former stone quarry has now been repurposed to have an interior zip line in it. It's a storage place for historic films. It's really an interesting repurposing of that site. Anyhow, that's one example of what quarries look like. In the bottom right picture, this edging was part of a barn and it was starting to get overgrown. And I pulled all of this stone out of this and put it into the wall in one of the earlier images that has a little half arch in the middle of it, retaining wall. So these are some examples of the actual sites where you could consider. I don't have a picture of a stone yard, but there's plenty of them in Western North Carolina and other areas. Stone moving tools. The primary way that you might consider moving stone once you get it to your property will be using tools that have wheels. The wheel is such a fantastic invention. The two that I use the most often, the first is a hand truck, which is also called a dolly. I've got a photo of it coming up. That's the easiest way because you don't have to lift the stone. If you simply tumble it onto the flat plate at the bottom of the dolly or hand truck, you can then lean it back and move it around to your site. I use one with really wide, knobby tires that don't go flat to move stone around a project once it's been delivered. Sometimes I use a wheelbarrow to move stone. You can either lift stone up and put it in a wheelbarrow, or you can turn the wheelbarrow sideways, push stone into it, and then flip it back up. So those are two of the easiest manual ways to move stone on your property. Another way to move stone is with a pry bar, which is like a digging iron, and a fulcrum. If you all can remember way back to our early elementary education when they had pictures of a long bar and a fulcrum, it's possible to move significant weights of stone with that, rowing stones into place just like rowing a boat. It usually takes two people on the opposite side of moving a really large stone, such as a boulder, using pry bars and fulcrums where they team up. You have to count and say, okay, on three, 1, 2, 3. And then you can lift a boulder up, row it with the pry bar and fulcrum, set it down, and then continue to position that as you need. Other things that can help moving stone is the wide nylon webbing or something similar to that. You can strap around a stone to either pull it by hand, pull it with a truck, pull it with equipment, but nylon straps tend to grip stone and not slide off as often as a chain would. So I use a wide variety of width of nylon strap when I'm going to move a stone. And then also a come along. It looks like a ratchet. You can connect it to a fixed point like a tree, wrap the other end around a stone, and it's a hand cranked device. I've got a picture of it. It takes a long time to use the come along, but if you have some rollers under it, it's pretty empowering to move a really large stone by hand. These are all primarily manual ways to move stone. If you have a bobcat or even a walk behind bobcat or an excavator, those are additional heavier duty machines and equipment that can allow you to move stone. Here's some examples of some of those. The hand truck, which is also called a dolly at the bottom left. This is one I bought that was maybe $100 or so at Tractor Supply. I have really wide knobby tires so that it can grip irregular terrain if you're moving stones through grass in your yard or across gravel or across dirt. It's quite easy to tumble stone that's already on the ground onto that plate at the bottom. You just lean back and move that stone to where you want it. That's the easiest. That's what I use the most. Next to it is a wheelbarrow. This is a really heavy duty wheelbarrow. The brand of this one is Jackson, and it's built stronger than some wheelbarrows and can handle the heavy use that stonemasonry involves. I recommend that brand if you don't already have one and you're going to move a lot of stone or gravel. It's a real durable, stout tool to have in your yard. The fulcrum and lever examples I have in the upper right corner. The piece of wood is a 4-inch by 4-inch and I think 2 feet long. That's the fulcrum. I have 4 different sizes of pry bars in that. The longest one is maybe about 6 feet tall, and I simply put the flat, almost pointed end of that under a stone. I rest the pry bar on the 4-inch by 4-inch wood, and when I press down on the bar, it lifts up the stone. That's a pretty easy way to move heavier stones. And there's also a 3-foot bar. For what it's worth, that bar was made by my great grandfather, who I'm named after, so I've used that quite a bit through the years. And then 2 smaller ones. I think there's a 2-foot, the red one, the lower one, and then the really small pry bar. Sometimes those are called wonder bars that you can put when you're moving smaller stone just to adjust it. Those bottom 2 often help if you're fine tuning the position of a stone and don't want to have your fingers under it. It's much safer to use these types of pry bars to move a stone as opposed to putting your fingers beneath a stone to lift it and push it. So I do use those tools every day when I'm moving stone and setting stone. Then the bottom right image, that's a come along device on the left. You can see it's got hooks on either end. On the left, where there's a hook with a chain through it, you can wrap that directly around a stone or wrap it around a nylon webbing if you need to get a better grip on it. The other end, the hook on the right, you have to fasten to something fixed, such as your car or a tree or something that allows the come along to be stationary. And you move the hand crank with the red handle back and forth and back and forth. That is one way to move stone, most often in conjunction with rollers, which could either be plastic PVC pipe or metal pipe, for example, vertical metal pipes that hold up chain link fence. I've cut up those before to use as rollers. I've used wooden rollers in conjunction with the come along. And then the nylon webbing on the right, that one's had some wear and tear on it. But the nylon webbing is really advantageous because the nature of the material grips stone. It grips the irregular surface of stone really well. This is a single strap that can be wrapped around a stone and also to lift them. It's also possible to have a nylon webbing that's literally like a web for larger boulders. A trail building project I worked on, they put big boulders in what looked like a spider web of this nylon material and hauled the boulders uphill. So nylon webbing is quite versatile. You can also team up with two people. If you have two of these straps, you can put it under a large boulder and lift it up depending on the size. So these are just ways to consider empowering you to move stones once you have it onto your own property for your projects. For stone shaping tools, the primary tools that would be worth considering if you're going to be shaping stone for your own projects are hand tools, in particular, good quality hammers and chisels. With the exception of a gas-powered cutoff saw, the bulk of work that I've done with stone the last 28 years has been hammer and chisel. I have shaped stone by hand in order to make it fit into whatever project I was building. There's different quality hammers and chisels. A lot of hardware stores will sell those. Better quality ones that have what are called carbide tips on a hammer and on a chisel. Most of those I end up ordering online. They're not as readily available at hardware stores. So a range of hammers and a range of chisels can help as you begin shaping stone for your own projects. There's a couple of resources online, better quality hammers and chisels that have the carbide tips. The carbide tip on a hammer and chisel reduces the amount of time that you swing to shape a stone. It also reduces the amount of time you have to grind it back down to keep what's called an edge on it. If I had made a single change in my tool I used through the years, I would have started off with a carbide, what's called a brick hammer or mason's hammer. It's the basic stonemasonry hammer, just because that's the one I've ended up using the most. For those of you that are confident to operate power tools, there's a range of them that are used in stone shaping. For example, there are electric grinders, a spinning wheel with a diamond blade on it to cut stone. I use a 4.5-inch grinder. For electric, sometimes I'm running it off an electric cord plugged into a generator outlet, but also use battery powered grinders so I can move around more quickly to make cuts. I put a cup wheel on them, which looks like an upside down saucer. That's another way to reduce on stone. I have a 7-inch grinder and 7-inch cup wheel, and then I have a 14-inch diamond blade on a gas saw. And the final power tool I use to shape stone, I use a hammer drill, and I put a 4-pointed carbide bit in my hammer drill, and I drill holes through a stone. It can be a straight line, it can be a curved line. And then I tap in what's called feathers and wedges. This is the oldest known way of splitting stone. And I've got some pictures of that coming up. The feathers and wedges that I referenced is used in conjunction with the drilled holes through a stone. Feathers and wedges, I buy them now on Amazon. I can get a set of 10 for $50. And that's not as common of a stone shaping tool to find in a hardware store. So that one I end up purchasing online. Okay, here's some photograph examples of those. On the left, these are what are known as feathers and wedges. And I've drilled holes into this sandstone and I've tapped in. The feathers are the parts that flare out to the left and right. and the wedge goes in between the feathers. When you tap down on that with a hammer, with a little bit of success, you can shape a stone, a larger stone, into a smaller one using this very process. This is my preferred way to shape large stones. It's quieter than the gas saw. Most importantly, when it breaks successfully, not only do you have this content in having it work, but it makes a sound like when they have a champagne bottle on a boat launch. It's a jingly metal sound. So it's a real gratifying way to shape. You can make a straight line, as I've done here. You can make a curved line. You can make a circle. It is the oldest known way of shaping stone. In the upper right, I have some examples of power tools. The bottom left tool is a 4.5-inch diameter grinder, and it has a diamond blade on it. And I use that for scoring stone. The larger device is a gas-powered cutoff saw that has a 14-inch diameter blade. I know for a lot of you that might not be something you're going to want to operate, but for making straight cuts quickly, it is pretty expedient to use that. Now, with those types of tools, I always have quite a bit of safety gear. I like to have protective glasses on when I'm using that, same if I'm using a hammer chisel. And I use ear protection, and I also use a dust mask. There are several versions of both of these that have a water line input, which greatly reduces the dust in the air. So that's a consideration if you are going to purchase a power tool. If there's a water line on it, it makes it easy to make a cut for one person when the water is plugged into the tool. At the bottom right, these are some examples. It's what I call a striking hammer. The hammer on the bottom is a 2 to 3 pound hammer. The chisel on the left, I think that one has a 1/2 inch diameter end. And then the middle one is, I think, 2 1/4 inches. The chisel on the right was custom made for me as a gift from workshop students I had at Penland School of Crafts in North Carolina. That would have been maybe 15 years ago. They had a metalworking class going on while I was leading a stone class. And the students had myself and my co-instructor had that metalworking class and make that chisel for us. Those are some examples of regular chisels. I think the two on the left I bought at Lowe's or Home Depot or a hardware store. Same with that striking hammer on the bottom. All right, ways to move stone. When you're going to have stone moved from a stone yard or a quarry, if you can have your stone delivery for your home project be made in a very deliberate way that will reduce the amount of time and energy that you have to move it again. If you're buying bulk stone, for example, if you're going to do a whole lot of retaining wall or a whole lot of drystone fences, sometimes that stone will be delivered with a dump truck. If you're purchasing stone that is already palletized, as flagstone often is, that's better to have delivered with a flatbed truck that has a boom, which is like a crane that mounts on the truck. That way, you can have the stone placed real deliberately, ideally on the same elevation as your project or slightly above, so that you're moving stone at the same elevation or downhill. You don't want to wear yourself out moving stone uphill or from the front of your house to the back of your house. So having a delivery truck that has the crane or boom where you can have pallets of stone, even if it's boulders on those pallets, they can place it real specific where you'd like it. Once it's on your property, I've already discussed some of those ways, but for big ones, the pry bars and fulcrum rowing system is an easy way to move, relatively easy way to move big ones. With rollers, the physics behind using rollers to move the stone on your property, you're going to need to lift up a stone, whether it's flagstone that's 2 to 3 inches thick, or whether it's a boulder that weighs 1 ton. If you can pry up the front of it and get a roller beneath it, that's your start. Then if you can get another roller, pry up the back and put a roller behind that, you can push stones once they're on rollers. You can use a come along to pull them. You can hook it up to your car. If you have a little trailer hitch or something, you can fasten it. Rollers are also one of the oldest known ways of moving stone. Any material, you can make a roller out of rigid PVC plastic, a certain diameter. Sometimes I use what are called concrete stakes. They're about 3/4 of an inch thick, and they have holes drilled in them for screws when people are pouring concrete. I've used wooden rollers and then larger ones, like I mentioned before, cutting up the vertical posts on a chain link fence. Having a range of size of rollers is really helpful way to move stone. That way it's not dragging across soil or grass or stone, whatever you have. If the terrain beneath a stone you're wanting to move is irregular, you can throw down something, even cardboard can help the roller move more smoothly. If you have some plywood, you can put that under and in front of a stone so that you're pushing your stone on rollers across a smoother surface. If it's irregular with gravel or chips of rock or soil or sod, grass that you've removed from your yard, it's a little bit harder to use the rollers. But the key thing is having a range of size of rollers that correspond with the size stone that you're going to be moving. Okay, on the left, here's a picture from our elementary school education. This is an image that shows the different ways that the fulcrum and lever work. All three of these are ways that I use on a daily basis to move stone. So the fulcrum in these pictures is a triangle, and what I'm usually using is a piece of 4-inch by 4-inch lumber. You can see the picture on the right. I'm pretty sure that's a stone that they've got. So that's the basic premise of what I call rowing. You row the boat ashore with the fulcrum and lever. Then the wheelbarrow, that is the exact same process. The fulcrum in this case is the axle that goes through. That's a two-tired wheelbarrow, which I recommend. It's a lot more stable having two tires on the wheelbarrow instead of just one. It's easier to set it down and pick it up with less movement left and right. Last but not least, the excavator. The fulcrum on that is more or less an axle that goes through the juncture where the scooping part and the supporting part meet right there in the middle. I've got some examples here. On the upper right, this is a project I did in Buladine, North Carolina. We used a motorized wheelbarrow. We had to work up a steep slope where we could not get any equipment larger than this to move stones. We moved quite a significant amount of tonnage of stone and gravel uphill with this device. It has a tilt bed on it. You can rent those also. At the bottom right is a picture of a Kubota, essentially a farm tractor. It's a medium-sized one. This machine is really versatile to pick up stones and move them. You can rent them. You can also hire an equipment operator. Often they have their own equipment who can help place stones real specifically to where you want it on your property. So after you get a delivery, it's a consideration to have some equipment work, whether it's a bobcat or excavator. This is what's called an excavator. It has a bucket on the opposite end, and it has the narrower bucket with longer arm on the right-hand side. Okay, ways to shape stone. When you're considering shaping stone, what you're doing with it is you're removing stone. They have yet to invent a rock stretcher. So whenever you're shaping stone to make it fit into your project, you're going to be removing either with power tools or hand tools. And what I like to do is mark the stone with a pencil exactly on the part that I want to remove. Sometimes I score it with an electrical grinder. Other times I use a chisel to mark that pencil line so it stays there once I'm in the removal business. Marking a pencil, if you're butting two stones together, two pieces of flagstone, if you're building a patio, there might be a little bump on one of the stones that keeps the two stones that you're setting from having good contact. If there's that little bump, you can mark it with a pencil and then remove that part that you've marked. I keep quite a few sharpened pencils on my project sites because I'm constantly marking those stones to remove parts of them for what is called better joinery, where the two stones join together. For any of you all who have done woodworking, the process of shaping stone is somewhat similar to shaping wood. You're removing wood to get a better fit or better joinery. There's a question right there. So John's question is, I have sedimentary stone of some sort, which means it's probably sandstone or limestone, and it's falling off in layers. Yes, that happens. Is there any way to preserve stone from weathering? No, stone always weathers. I'm sorry, there's no secret on that. When stone falls off in layers, depending on its use, if it's in flagstone and it's in a patio, the way that it falls off is it peels off the top. It makes really thin layers, and this does happen with sandstone. There really aren't ways to stop that process from happening. Once the stone comes out of a quarry or bedrock, air interacts with it. It has a wider range of temperature interacting with it. It goes through the annual freeze-thaw cycle. And that process is what causes this falling off in layers. If you're choosing new stone, if you're at a stone yard or a quarry, you can look at the stone closely to see, is it already doing that? Sometimes the stone will just start to flake off or peel off in really small parts, and it ends up not being a problem. If it's really large parts of it, that's when the problems arise. You can put chemicals and stuff on stone, but essentially they age, they weather, and it's the type of stone that determines if it's going to break into sedimentary layers.
I got a question directly to me about similar kind of stone where it comes off in layer. Are there any suggestions about how to shape that kind of stone if that's what you're working with?
Yes, that's a really good question. When I'm working with that stone, and there is some in Western North Carolina that has that trait, if you're working it with a hammer and chisel, the fracture lines tend to break out irregular. That seems like schist, schist, sometimes has that problem. If I do have that stone, and I try to avoid stone that has the real flaky parts to it, is with power tools, because you're not sending additional fracture lines into the stone with hammer and chisel. And for power tools, that's either the feathers and wedges, where you drill holes and drop the feathers and wedges inside, or using an electric grinder, a battery powered grinder, the gas cutoff saw. So the stone that breaks off easily is problematic to work with. And I've done a couple projects with that type of stone, but in general, I try to avoid it because you can be hammering and chiseling on the edge, and then the fracture line irregularly goes across the face of it. So if possible, don't work with that stone. If you've already got it and you have to work with it, consider power tools, because the hammer and chisel will continue to cause fractures. That involves what we call the hardness of stone. Stone has a scale from 0 to 10. That's Mohs hardness scale. And those stones that are more crumbly, for example, gypsum is at the low end of hardness scale, and I think diamonds are at the top. They're 10. In general, most limestone and sandstone is a denser grain. So that's the bulk of the building I do. Some granite has a tight grain. So it's just important to look at the physical traits of the stone that you are working with if you're purchasing new stone. Okay, hammer and chisel, and then feathers and wedges. We've covered how feathers and wedges can be used to shape stone. Here's some examples of those stone shaping processes. On the left, this is a picture at the Black Mountain Center for Arts. This is a sitting wall that my workshop participants built. This is adjacent to their pottery studio. One of the participants is using a 3-pound striking hammer and a half-inch diameter chisel to cut the edge off of the stone so that the next one can butt up against it. The type of stone he's using is a sandstone. That's from Central Tennessee. It's called Crab Orchard. If you look at that sandstone right where he's chiseling, you can see the sedimentary layers. Notice his safety gear. He's got work gloves on and safety glasses and a hat, and the chisel, that's important. If you're going to start chiseling stone, consider getting a stone with what I call a knuckle guard. A lot of chisels don't have that. Unless you have really good hand-eye coordination, it's possible that the hammer in the right hand ends up hitting the left hand instead of the chisel. That's why for workshops, I provide chisels that have what I call the knuckle guard there. So that's one example of shaping stone. There's also a couple of tools here that I use often when I'm shaping. The blue handled hammer in the foreground at the lower part of that photograph, that's the basic brick hammer or mason's hammer. This one weighs, I think, 20 ounces, and most hardware stores will carry this type of hammer. That's the type that I use the most often when I'm hammering on a stone to do removal. You can see there's a little copper shaped piece, a carbon arc rod. That's what I use for marking stones sometimes. It's similar to a pencil, and you just peel the copper back around it instead of getting out a knife to sharpen it, so it's faster. That's another striking hammer to the left of that. You can see one of the 1 foot long pry bars. It's in front of the gentleman on the right, and that's used to lift up that stone a little bit to help pin it. Pinning means putting a small piece beneath it to ensure that it's a level left to right and level front to back. There's my custom made chisel and a broom to sweep off the dust. I like to clean surfaces before I set the next one. On the right, here's me setting the feathers and wedges into a stone that I've drilled. That's the hammer drill on the right-hand side. It's an electric powered drill with a carbide 4-point bit that I drill through those stones. At the bottom right, this is a tile saw. I built a beehive shaped sculpture there in Black Mountain, and all of the pieces going in were leftover kitchen counter scrap. This is my friend David Reed, who is cutting one of the kitchen counter scrap pieces. We had to shape them all sort of pizza shaped triangles to fit for that. So that's another option. The tile saw, that's a 14-inch blade where you can push the stone into that. It has water to keep the dust down. It's quite safe. You can see the handle on top. It's real similar to a chop saw used in carpentry. David, of course, has his safety gear. He's got safety glasses on and ear protection and a hat. Those are some examples of ways of shaping stone: power tools and hand tools. 15 great raw kits. The number one project that workshop participants want to build or repair through my years of leading workshops has been retaining walls. A lot of people want to build a new retaining wall or repair a retaining wall that has failed. These 15 traits of retaining walls are the traits that make stone, in particular dry stone retaining walls, last the longest over time. We can look at retaining walls around the world, for example, stone retaining walls that are part of World Heritage Sites. The bulk of World Heritage Sites are stone structures. And so we can study these and quantify a couple ways of how these retaining walls are built. And this 15 Great Rock Kits is what those traits are. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read all of those. I think you all have this as a PDF handout, plus you'll have access to it. But just trust that people who have worked with stone before us have gone through a lot of trial and error through the millennia, and this is what it boils down to. Every retaining wall that I build has these traits. Safety. It's really important to keep your work area clean and organized. If you have stones and tools in the way of where you're moving stone, you can trip over them and fall. Please don't do that. I keep a first aid kit visible at all times while I'm working, whether it's me solo, with a crew, with a workshop, so that if somebody has something, even if they pinch their finger and cut it or something, it's nice to have a first aid kit visible instead of sending somebody to look for one. You can buy those at hardware stores or online. If you're working in a remote location and you're working solo, go ahead and come up with plan B. If you have an accident, you want to make sure you know the closest place to go to remedy that accident. For example, a quick clinic or a hospital or something like that. So these are just some general ideas to keep in mind so far as being safe once you start working with stone. Here's some safety photographs. It might look wild, but the stone project on the left is relatively clean and organized. I have all the stone in a windrow, a single pile. I have a canopy to keep the sun off of us. That's in Black Mountain, North Carolina on the left. Upper right, that's my basic safety kit. I have a movable knee pads. If I'm working down low, I wear the gloves to protect my hands. I have prescription safety glasses. There's one of my first aid kits. The little orange things you can put inside of your ear, even the sound of hammer and chisel, it can help soften that. The photo in the bottom right, this is a workshop at Penland School of Crafts where we're doing a restoration. And you can see he's got the pants that you wear doing chainsaw work. He's got ear protection. I see a question up here, particular suggestions of gloves. Yes, there's not a brand, but the snug fitting work gloves work best with stonework. So you can feel, for example, when you're putting the little pieces of stone under a bigger one to make it level. Snug fitting work gloves work better than the rough leather ones. Project planning. You want to measure length, width, and height of what you're going to build and get those dimensions. That'll give you your cubic feet. On the average, stone weighs about 160 pounds per cubic foot. If you have 100 cubic feet, you multiply that by 165. Once you get your total pounds of stone you're going to need, divide it by 2,000, and that gives you your tons. Tons is a really consistent numerical way to quantify your stonework. You're going to buy 5 tons. If it costs 300 a ton, there's your budget. You're going to spend 1,500. So figuring out the tonnage of your project is the first part of doing your project planning. Here's some math. This is about figuring out the tonnage. It breaks it down into more detail. I won't go into all of that math, but basically in the picture on the left, you measure the length, the width, and the height of a stone, and you're able to gauge its approximate weight. If you took a basketball and made it square, stone at 1 cubic foot is 160, 165 pounds. That's slightly less. So a square shaped basketball of stone might be 125 pounds. Project design. Photograph your site. If it's your backyard, your front yard, your site yard, photograph where you're wanting to build. Then send that photograph to a print shop and have them enlarge it to, for example, 11 inches by 17 inches and laminate that. Then you can bring that back home and use dry erase markers. Start to draw what you want to build on your laminated photograph of the actual site. And then you can make changes with your dry erase markers until you get something that you like. If you don't want to do that process, you can get a landscape designer or landscape architect to do a drawing, but it's at least a start for doing that on your own, the project design. Here's some examples. I drew graph paper of a project that I built. That's on the left, where you measure out and you can make all of the changes as you need. The one in the upper right, I hired a landscape architect to draw that stone feature. Then the bottom right, on every site that I come to for landscaping, I pay attention to the orientation, more southeast and west. And I've been orienting my stonework to cardinal directions, solar cycle, lunar cycle for quite some time now, probably 20 years or more. This is a gauge that I use on every site just to pay attention to where those directions are. Okay, here's some best practices for specific projects. I won't go into the details of all those, but if you're going to be doing a landing, a patio, retaining wall, sitting wall, these are some of the essential ways to consider doing these projects that will make them last the longest. And that's the focus of my work and my educational outreach on stonemasonry, is building things that we know last the longest based on what we can actually see around the planet. Here's some example. If you're going to do steps, do a single stone. You'll save time, You'll likely save money. They look large. Either do it with equipment or some of the tools I've mentioned. Single stone steps last longer than multiple small stones put together. Okay, here's another question. Will I be explaining how to build that stone staircase? We did the bottom couple of steps by hand using the fulcrum and lever to set those. And then the ones up above, we brought in an excavator to drop them in. I used a bubble level to make sure they were level left to right and front to back. I set it on crushed gravel, which is about the size of your pinky fingernail. It has friction and you can compact it. Okay, here's another question. Single stone steps are better. You have to think smaller, lighter, easier. Can I give advice on building multiple stone steps? Same size gravel. Yes, same size gravel if you're going to do that beneath it. Get the largest stones that you can move safely. If you're not going to do it in a single one, get the largest ones that you can do safely to build up, and then get a single piece of flagstone as your top surface, and that will help hold together your smaller stones beneath. The retaining wall in the upper right, which is in Western Pennsylvania, that reflects best practices in retaining walls. It leans in at the top, and I have real heavy capstones that presses weight down on top of that to hold them in place. How do you prevent ants from nesting below patios? That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, except I use crushed gravel beneath my stone instead of sand. If you use sand or something like it, ants love it. Crushed gravel, which is about the size of your pinky finger. Sometimes it's called 3/8. At the bottom, this workshop participant is shaping the edge of the stone so it has tighter joinery. This is the site where I'm working today in Gallup, New Mexico. We built this arch last summer. We're building an arch facing it. We'll complete it today. This reflects best practices. This is all drystone. This is a drystone fence buttress on the left and right. The joints are staggered where one or more stones come together. Another stone breaks it. It has the weight needed. It tapers. You can see the wall head on the right, slightly wider at the base, and it narrows in as it goes up. The arch, the word architecture and the phrase landscape architecture is based on this very feature. I started building arches 28 years ago. We were doing a lot of entryways to horse farms around Lexington, Kentucky, and a lot of those had arches. The process of building the arch is you make a half circle out of plywood or other types of wood. You set it up, for example, in this picture, it rested on that dark colored stone that's at the bottom of the arch. I put some shims on it. We shaped each stone with a piece of plywood template so that we knew they would fit together well. Once we had each stone shaped, we set it up on top of our semicircle wooden arch form that ends up looking like a protractor is what was underneath here. Once it's completed, you pull the shims out beneath the semicircle wooden arch form. It drops. In fact, I made a video of this one when we were removing the wooden arch form. It's very important when building an arch, the weight of the stones to the left and the right of the arch help hold the sides from wanting to push out. The weight of the stones pushing down from the center, if you didn't have these buttresses on left and right, the arch would want to collapse. The two traits that hold together these stones, as in all Drystone masonry features, is friction and gravity. That's the right answer to most questions about drystone in your landscape. Pay attention to how your stones make use of friction. You want to have more points of contact instead of less, and always take into account that gravity is working 24/7.
Joe, there was a question earlier about the arch. There was some scoring on those buttress stones to the left, and there were several questions about what that scoring is about.
Yes, that's from the feather and wedge process. This stone and two stones down below it, those came from really large boulders that we moved with equipment. In order to shape these stones to fit, what we did was use feathers and wedges. I drilled holes into the perimeter of this, used the feathers and wedges to break the stones accurately. None of those drill marks to the left will show. The clients are putting adobe brick up next to it. The ones that are on the face, some clients say, What's that? Hammer it off of there. Others say, hey, that shows humans built this and not ancient aliens. When you drive down the highway, you can see these similar types of drill marks where they break out the bedrock on the left and right of roads. That's what these are. They've drilled down through that, and they either use feather and wedges or small explosives to make it. That's one half of a drill mark. John's got a question. How do you lay out the stone so all the pieces come together without having to move it around several times? Great question. One of the most important tools I left out of this, unfortunately, is a tape measure. You can measure your stones before moving them to see if they're going to be the right fit. You can also make cardboard templates. Lay a piece of cardboard on top or below a piece of stone, trace it out, cut it. You can put them together that way. Here's a question. Do you have any tips about a stone water feature? Yes, I do. You want to dig a little pond beneath it, maybe 2 feet deep. I pour them out of concrete. Then I buy a smaller boulder or pour concrete to hold that feature water stone up. You got to core drill a hole through it, then run your water line from the bottom with a float valve so it automatically refills. Those are my tips about a stone water feature. Take a single big stone, have it core drilled where they drill a hole through it, and then you run your water line through that hole at the bottom. Water comes out the top, goes into a pond, and I use a heavy duty wire mesh so the water can fall through the mesh into the pond, and that's where you get the sound effect. You can adjust that with the float valve that controls it and also the distance that the water falls. Measuring and site prep advice. Get a tape measure or 100-foot longer, measure out your site, put that onto graph paper. The graph paper, pencil so you can erase and make changes, and tape measures. 2 types of tape measures, the regular kind that might be 25 feet long, and then I use the 100-foot long for bigger projects. Measure all the components of what's on your site. Think about measuring the types of stone. How big a stone can you move? It might be 50 pounds, 75. The larger the stones that we put into place, the heavier the stone we move, the harder it is for Mother Nature to dislodge it. So there are merits in moving towards larger stones. Can you use pea gravel for a flagstone walkway? You can. Lots of people do. I don't. Pea gravel tends to be rounded, hence the name. When you have rounded stones, things tend to want to move. Also, there aren't as many points of contact. So I don't use pea gravel for a flagstone walkway. Again, it's the crushed gravel, which is sometimes called 3/8. That's about the measurement of it. But everybody look at your pinky fingernail. That's the size gravel you want to have beneath flagstone.
Joe, there was one earlier about a patio or walkway. Do you need to fill in gaps between flagstone with setting sand?
That's a good question. There's a lot of choices, and there's no one right answer for that. Some flat work, I cut or hammer and chisel the stones so that they touch one another. If you're gonna leave a gap between them, you open yourself up to other things. There's benefits, for example, with rainwater. The larger gap you have between your stones, the more rainwater can go down between them instead of building up at the edge of your patio or walkway. However, once you leave that gap open, seeds will make their way in there and sprout. It's almost inevitable no matter what material. I have tried and no longer use the polymer sands. They just haven't worked. It's not a durable product. It hasn't been on the market that long. I think I did 2 or 3 projects and it was the same sad story each time. So I used crushed gravel, the 3/8 gravel. If a client wants to have an opening between the stones, that's what I put between there. It doesn't move if you're sweeping or using a leaf blower. It's a more stabilizing thing to have in between your stones.
Do you have clients that like to plant in that area?
Yes, there's several types of plants that you can use to fill that gap area between your flagstones. Creeping thyme is the one that comes to my mind right now, but there's plenty of others that you can actually walk over with minimal damage. Is the woman in Western North Carolina known as Annie the Moss Lady still doing stuff? She
Yeah.
knows about some mosses that you can plant in there. Sedums are another example.
Yeah, I think they coined the term a number of years ago, horticulturist walkables or something like that. You can find them in nurseries and garden centers around the area. Small plants that can take a little bit of traffic. There's a question that came to me about recommending a base for a small bed wall, or is it okay to start and lay it directly on the soil?
I don't know the phrase bed wall. Let me just speculate. That means a garden bed. You can lay it directly in soil or on gravel, either work. But what's important is the first course of stones, called a foundation course, if you can bury that stone halfway. So half of the stone is below ground and half of the stone is above ground. The soil ends up stabilizing that first course of stones. If you have a 6-inch stone, put 3 inches of that stone beneath the elevation of your grass or whatever it's going up to, your patio.
I want to go back to the steps because it's always seems to be a puzzle about the rise and the run, right? You talked about designing, and I know that's probably a whole nother topic for today. Can you just give a brief understanding about how to plan for that?
Yes, the rise and run, which is the mathematical part of steps. What you want to do to gauge that is measure the distance front to back as you're facing where the steps are. You just want to make sure you're measuring that in a horizontal way with your tape measure, not at an angle. For example, in the photograph of the steps at Penland, here they are. That's exactly how we gauge this. We measured from the very top step out to where the bottom one was, and we used a string line to make sure it was level in a really tall 6 or 8 level where you make sure it's plumb. We measured the distance front to back. Then we also measured the height, which I usually eyeball because I'm exactly 6 foot. So I can look and if it's my height, that's 6. If you think about steps being an average of 6 inches each, it makes the math easier. So let's just do the math on these steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So I have 14 steps. And if that's 6 inches each, who's good with math that can tell me what that height is? I'll give you a hint. 14 divided by 2. That's a 7 foot. So when I was standing at the bottom, I thought, it's about a foot taller than me. So that's how you can gauge. I like to have a 3-inch overhang of each step over the other one. So let's just say this feature was 15 feet front to back. I've got to make sure I buy enough stones that I can have 3 inches of overhang from this step that's on top of the one below it. So that's the essence of the math for rise and run with steps. You want to figure out how much material do you buy to get you up to that height. Another advantage of working with 6-inch single ones is it makes the math easy.
Can you talk about drainage under or behind a retaining wall?
I sure can. One of the merits of Drystone Masonry, which is the historical record of the longest lasting drystone retaining walls globally, it self-drains. There are some times where people will put perforated pipe or landscape fabric and such behind the walls. However, the stone will greatly outlive any modern stuff we're making, perforated plastic pipe or landscape fabric. The only times that I'm using landscape fabric is while I'm building. If soil starts to fall down into my retaining wall, I put landscape fabric against it because the goal in building is to keep the organic matter out. If you let the soil fall in or leaves settle in there, it turns to compost down the road and tree roots seek it out. So I, in general, don't use man-made materials behind a dry stone retaining wall. Also recommend never mortar a retaining wall because the mortar traps water behind it. That increases the sideways pressure, and walls that fail are often mortared retaining walls. There's no known examples of long-lasting mortared retaining walls. Those tend to collapse because they've trapped water behind them.
We've often gotten calls from individuals with mortar retaining walls where a lot of water collects behind them and the plants don't thrive. I guess that can be another issue.
Yeah, that's anaerobic soil conditions. With the retaining walls, you lean them back, and that's another trait that makes them resist that lateral pressure coming in.
We've gone over our time, but I have one more. If we're looking to hire somebody in to do a project, and you've spoken about having a landscape architect or an architect do some design work, but you're actually hiring the stonemason to come in, what are some things we need to consider?
That's a really good question. Meeting them in person, trust your instinct. If they form full sentences and stand upright, that's a good sign for stonemasons. Their portfolio, if they have examples of work that they've built that matches what you're wanting. For example, if you want to have a circular patio, ask if you can see examples. Usually a portfolio, whether it's on the website or if they have a printed out book or a 3-ring binder with images, the body of work is a good gauge. Just trust your instinct when you're talking with them. Does it look like somebody who's going to do a good job and show up on time, and maybe ask around for references? Those are some ways to try and assess if the person is going to be qualified and do a good job with your project.
That's great. I'm just so grateful for you calling in from Gallup and spending your morning with us, Joe. Beautiful work, and excited to hear more about this project that you're showing us here with the archway. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I've enjoyed being part of Gardening in the Mountains. My first Master Gardener's presentation was 2001, so that is 23 years now. I've really enjoyed my interactions with Master Gardeners through the years. I learned quite a bit, and I'm glad to help out with what you all are doing in your home or business projects.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Next month on June 20th, we're shifting to a topic that's new for us on fairy gardens. We hope to see you then, and everybody have a great day.